Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill, a show where we talk about bitter pills of truth that the corporate media don't want you to know about and that people would rather not swallow. So as you can see, I'm wearing my vegan shirt today. It's a cool shirt, I like it. And today I want to talk about a show that, article I came across that's been making the rounds in the news lately. And here's what it is. Vegetarian and vegan diets and risk of total and site-specific fractures results from the prospective EPIC Oxford study. And it's resulted in headlines such as the following: vegetarians and vegans and pescatarians may be at higher risk of bone fractures. Vegans may be at higher risk of bone fractures, study finds. Vegans have a higher risk of bone fractures if they scrimp on calcium, protein, and vitamin B12, a study found, which isn't actually what the study found, and we'll get to that. Vegans, non-meat eaters have increased risk for bone fractures. Vegetarian or vegan, watch your bone health. This diet is bad for your bones, new study finds. Okay, so is this a bitter pill of truth that I don't want to hear about? Well, let's talk about it. Well, first of all, let's talk about what the news says about it. I'm a scientist and also happen to be a vegan, as I was just talking about. So when I see news accounts of a purportedly scientific paper making some claim or another about a negative health effect of being vegan, and in the process ignoring all the health benefits of being at least a whole foods vegan who doesn't spend all day eating French fries or something, of vastly lower rates of heart disease and some forms of cancer and diabetes and Alzheimer's disease and a number of other ailments than meat eaters do. And of course, there's the benefit that you're not exploiting and killing animals and causing them to suffer. You're not contributing as much to greenhouse gas emissions as someone who consumes a lot of animal products and so forth. So, people periodically try to knock down the idea of being vegan or even vegetarian because they are very defensive about eating meat. Deep down, they know that it hurts and kills animals, and they may or may not have heard about environmental issues related to diet. But in any case, so I looked up the paper and gave it a critical read through. And so today, what I like to do is just go through the article and talk about what it said. Well, first of all, let's take a look at one of these news pieces. So, oh gosh, the New York Times says, vegetarian or vegan, watch your bone health. Those who ate a meat-free diet were in increased risk for bone fractures. Vegetarian diets are generally considered healthy, but new research suggests they may have a significant risk, an increased chance of bone fractures. The study found that compared with meat eaters, vegetarians had a 9% increased risk for any fracture, and vegans a 43% increased risk. Blah, blah, blah. The associations were weaker but still significant after additional adjustments for protein and calcium intake. It's very important that vegetarians and vegans have adequate intakes of protein and calcium, said the lead author, Tammy Tong, nutritional epidemiologist at Oxford, said. If they can't get it from diet, they should use supplements. Okay, so the lead author of this paper is claiming that vegetarians and vegans have a high rate of bone fractures compared to meat eaters, and implying that it's because they're not getting enough calcium and protein. well, as we'll see, her own study doesn't support such claims. But in any case, here's another article about it from CNN. This one's a little better. It goes into a little more of the details. Now I'll go through it, but just, I mean, if you only read the headline, which is what a lot of people do, you just see the headline, vegans may be at higher risk for bone fractures, study finds. And so you're like, oh God, I'm going to be too fragile to walk out the door if I eat a vegan diet. But if you read through the article, it does talk about some of the details of the study that actually don't support the claim that the lead author made here in the New York Times, that intake of protein and calcium is a major problem for vegans in terms of bone health. Okay, well, without further ado, let's look at the study, which was published in a good journal. I looked up the impact factor for this journal, BMC Medicine, and it's one of the top 10 medical journals, ranked 10th in terms of impact factor. But as we'll see, it really, for someone like me who's used to evaluating research, it really comes across more as a propaganda piece masquerading as research than it does sound research. And that's not to say that there aren't any valid findings, otherwise it wouldn't have been published here, although one has to wonder if the reviewers were fully awake when they read the paper. But the authors misrepresent what their findings mean, and they not only allowed that misrepresentation to be repeated ad nauseum in the mainstream media, as you saw there, they reinforce that misrepresentation in their public comments. And I just gave you one example of that, and we'll see why it's a misrepresentation in a moment. There's just, and I looked through quite a few of these mainstream media accounts of this research, and there's just a lack of critical thinking for the most part on the part of journalists who report on scientific research. They often don't appear to have even read the article that they're reporting on, although this CNN piece, which I'll link to, did a little bit better job of going through some of the details. But really the entire premise of this sort of study, that broad categories of diets, such as vegan or vegetarian or omnivore, are intrinsically related to some health issue. That's a flawed premise because, I could eat French fries for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and snacks in between, and I'd be vegan, but obviously that wouldn't be a healthy diet. Or I could eat lettuce all day long, and that would at least be a lot healthier than eating French fries all day long, but it still wouldn't give me enough of certain nutrients, and most importantly, it wouldn't provide enough calories, because lettuce is a very low calorie dense food, which, by the way, eating a lot of those types of foods is a good idea if you're trying to lose weight, but you have to eat a balanced diet no matter who you are and whether you're a meat eater or vegan or whoever. You're not going to get heart disease if you eat lettuce all day long, but you'll probably develop some other problems. On the other hand, if you eat Big Macs all day long, you'll be getting enough calories, no doubt about that, but you'll in the long run develop other health issues, pretty likely heart disease in fairly short order, for example. But still, there's a big difference between eating Big Macs 3 times a day and eating a balanced diet that, although meat is never really very good for you, as we can talk about another time, eating it in small amounts and balancing that out with lots of whole foods, fresh fruits and vegetables and grains and beans and so on and so forth. You're probably going to be pretty healthy. So again, the point is, these studies that look at broad labels for diet, such as vegan or vegetarian or omnivore, whatever, is just simplistic to look at the relationship between diet and health in that manner. You've got to look at what specifically people eating. What are the nutrients? What's the calorie consumption, and so on and so forth. Because you could eat a variety of different diets that fell into one of those categories. That, for example, would have different effects on bone health. And there are many things that affect people's likelihood of breaking bones besides diet. And even if diet does appear to be associated with some outcome, such as in this case, certain kinds of bone fractures, we can't just assume that whatever diet it is causally related, because some other factor could be correlated with diet. So we'll look closely at that. So let's go down through this study here. One claim that they make is that previous epidemiological studies have shown that vegetarians had lower bone mineral density than non-vegetarians. And similarly, there have been previous epidemiological studies that have found that about vegans. However, what they don't tell you is that there are also epidemiological studies that find that bone mineral density is just fine. So here's a study of long-term vegan nuns. And found that although vegans had lower dietary calcium and protein intakes than omnivores, veganism did not have an adverse effect on bone mineral density and did not alter body composition. They go on to say in this article about diet and bone breaking, potential risk differences are plausible, even though the association of vegetarian or vegan diets with fracture risks is unclear. They say potential risks differences are plausible owing to differences in several dietary factors, such as substantially lower intakes of calcium in vegans and lower intakes of dietary protein in both vegetarians and vegans, and the lower body mass index of non-meat eaters. Lower body mass index. Wonder what that could be about. We'll come back to that. In fact, if you look at what amounts of different nutrients we actually need, the protein and calcium consumption of the average vegan is perfectly normal, perfectly adequate. And it's actually meat eaters who get way more protein than their body needs on average, and this actually has adverse health effects. And most people get more calcium than they actually need as well. This assumption, this notion that you are likely to not get enough calcium from eating a vegan diet because you're not consuming cow's milk, or products of cow's milk, it's just fallacious. There are many plant foods that have lots of calcium. You know, eat a little bit of tofu. That's good. That's loaded with calcium. Okay, this is more than a little bit of tofu, but if you ate one block of tofu, like a 14-ounce block of tofu, not just raw, but cook it in something and then eat it, then you'll be getting more than 1,000 grams of calcium, which is well over what you need. The one thing that I should mention about this study is that they didn't look at vitamin D intake, which is really important to bone health. And they should have, but they didn't. Now, that's not to say that you're supposed to satisfy your requirement for vitamin D by eating it in your food. In fact, there's not really too many foods that naturally have vitamin D in them. We mainly get it from sunlight. So, if you're outside in the sun, for like 15 minutes a day or something like that, you'll often get more than enough vitamin D. But that does vary because, for one thing, a lot of people don't get outside that much, or they're all bundled up because it's cold, or they live in a latitude far from the equator so that the sun's not very intense, and during the winter the days don't last long at all, and so forth. In short, there's a lot of vitamin D deficiency in industrialized countries because of those reasons, and it's something that is common in people regardless of their diet. But these days, you find fortified foods that are sources of nutrients you need, like vitamin D and calcium and vitamin B12, even if it wasn't in the original food. But you really, the only nutrient that you had better either take a supplement for or get in a fortified food if you're vegan is vitamin B12. But anyway, oops. Let's look at the details of this study a bit. So basically, this was a very large sample study. They had tens of thousands of participants from a large study that's tracked diet and health outcomes and other things called the Oxford study. The EPIC Oxford study, been going on for 20 or 30 years, so it's a longitudinal, long-term study, and so that's where these data are from. And so anyway, they looked at a sample that included 30,000 or so meat eaters, 8,000 fish eaters. I'm not sure how fish isn't meat, but anyway, fish eaters meaning people who didn't eat other sorts of animal flesh. Vegetarians, 15,000 of those. Vegans, about 2,000 of those. And notice here, there's a lot of women in this study. Well over half in every group. 76% of the meat eaters, 64%, I guess, of the vegans, etc. Only half of the participants, approximately a little over half from each group, vegans, vegetarians, meat eaters, took a supplement, which, I mean, definitely if you're vegan, you should be taking a B12 supplement. If you're in any of these groups, you might want to take a vitamin D supplement because it's easy to get short on that in the winter. Another noticeable difference between the groups is body mass index. The meat eaters, for example, had a BMI of 24.5, which 25 is overweight, 24.5 is the high end of normal body weight. Vegans, on the other hand, averaged body mass index of 22, and there were almost a fourth of the sample of vegans who were under 20 kilograms per meter squared for their body mass index, whereas only 8% of the meat eaters were that thin. And over 36% of the meat eaters were overweight, greater than 25 body mass index. Only 14% of the vegans were overweight. Hey, I'm one of the 14%, woohoo! But anyway, you see there's differences there in calcium intake. Only about 60% of the calcium intake for vegans, as for the others in this particular study. Protein intake, not that different. 17% of calories were from protein for the meat eaters, 13% for the vegans, and kind of in between for the other groups. So, not that different. Now let's look at the good stuff, the fracture data. So they looked at the risks of different types of fractures, as well as the total fracture rate for all the different groups. And they looked at different models of that, where model 1 looked at the difference between groups with various things like physical activity, whether or not they smoked, and other things that you may or may not have something to do with fracture rates, kind of partialed out of the equation, so to speak. Model 2, they included body mass index as one of the things that they tried to take out of the equation, so to speak. They also did it with calcium, protein, and then the fifth model was calcium and protein. So, in other words, they only looked at people who had adequate amounts of one or both of those nutrients. Okay, so let's have a look here. Okay, so the meat eaters had more fractures, but there's a lot more of them. The average number of fractures was lowest in the meat eaters and fish eaters, and highest in the vegans. Looks like vegans have about 1.5 times the rate of fractures as the meat eaters. And the numbers that you see in parentheses here, that's the confidence interval. That means that there's a 95% chance that in the real world, where if you could get a perfect sample, there's a 95% chance that the real rate out in the world is between 1.26 and 1.78 here, and 0.87 and 1.07 here. So the key thing to look at is the lowest number here for the vegans low enough that it overlaps with the highest number for the meat eaters, and it doesn't. So overall fracture rate was significantly higher in the vegans. Probability of only 0.001, 1 in 1,000, that these differences are chance. And that difference for total fracture rate held across all the different models that excluded various issues. So model 5, for example, only looking at participants who had adequate amounts, or high amounts, let's say, of protein and calcium, you still found a difference, though not as big a difference. So it does matter. But let's go farther down here. How about arm fractures? you know, significant difference, for just an overall sample. But then when you look at the sample that has a high protein intake or a high protein and calcium intake, those probability values are around 0.2, and you need to have a probability of 0.05 or less to be considered a statistically significant difference between your groups. So as you can see there, the lower bound of 95% confidence interval for the vegans was well under 1, the average for the meat eaters. So they overlap a lot, in other words. Risk fractures, there's not a statistically significant difference between the groups for any of the analyses that they did. Hip fractures, huge differences. 2.5 times the rate of hip fractures in vegans versus meat eaters. Oh goodness, our bones are going to fall apart any minute. But and then leg fractures also significant, although not for every group. As you can see, those numbers are higher than 0.05. Ankle fractures, no difference. All those probability values are high, meaning it's highly likely that there's no difference between the groups. So basically, the differences were only for big bones like hips and legs, not for small bones like wrists and ankles. What do we make of that? Well, let's go further and see if we can figure this out. Okay, I think we already more or less talked about that. Shit. Well, I mean, basically what it boils down to is just the big bone fracture rates differ, not the small bones. But Table 5 is where it really gets interesting. Risks of total fractures by diet groups stratified by age, sex, menopausal status, physical activity, and body mass index. Okay, so a little bit bigger difference between the groups for those over 50 years old versus those under 50 years old. There weren't that many vegans who were over 50 years old in this sample. And it's not because they died, it's just because they had a smaller sample of people in that age range versus the meat eaters where most of them were over 50. Okay. Broken down by sex. For women, about this, almost the same as the overall difference here. For the meat eaters, that's just set as the comparison group, so the average there is 1. And for vegans, 1.5, they have about 50% greater rate of vegan females of breaking bones than the meat-eating females. High p-value there, 0.001. But look at the men. 1.18 versus 1. So about 18% higher likelihood, but tremendous variation. So not a significant difference. Probability of 0.64 that these two groups are not meaningfully different from each other. So basically then, this broad claim that they've made that vegans are more likely to break bones, first of all, it only applies for certain bones. And secondly, they only found it for women. They didn't find it for men. And none of those news articles talk about that, and the authors themselves, like the lead author, didn't even mention it in any of the quotes in any interviews that she gave. So totally misleading rendition of what the study found by the lead author. And similarly in this article, they really don't make much of the fact that they found a difference for women, but they didn't for men. Physical activity. Again, you find differences between those who were not physically active, where big difference between vegans and meat eaters there. About 43% more likely to break bones if you're vegan, but not a statistically significant difference here. It does seem a little bit higher, but given that this lower number here overlaps with 1, which is the average for the meat eaters, we don't know if there's a meaningful difference there. And the last piece of data on this in this table is breaking down the results by body mass index. So less than 22.5 kilograms per meter squared, which is right smack in the middle of normal body weight, versus greater than 22.5. And as you see, all of the action is in a less than 22.5 body mass index group. Probability of 0.001 that the groups are meaningfully different from each other, significantly different. For the people in the sample with a body mass index of greater than 22.5, which is the vast majority of the meat eaters, only a small number of the, or only a third of the vegans, you don't find a significant difference. This is not a statistically significant difference at all. And well, what do you make of that? Turns out that if you have a little extra fat on your body, that gives you some padding if you have a hard collision with something. So if you have a hard fall on your hip, or you have a car accident, high impact collision, you're a lot less likely to break a bone. In fact, you're even less likely to die in a car accident if you're significantly overweight. How's that for fun facts? So really, that could be a lot of what's going on in this study, is that because they're a lot less likely to be overweight, and unfortunately more likely to be underweight, but a lot less likely to be in the normal body weight range. A side effect of that is that it leaves you more vulnerable to having at least your bigger bones in your body get smacked really hard if you have some sort of accident. Smaller bones, there's not that much padding there no matter what. You don't have a lot of fat around your wrists or your ankles, so that doesn't matter. But for the bigger bones in your body, the amount of body fat that you have, or how much body fat you have determines how much the blow is cushioned if you have an accident. But let's go back up to the men versus women difference. Why do you suppose that it's only the women who have a difference in the likelihood of breaking bones as a function of what sort of broad category of diet they eat, whereas the men don't really show much of a difference, not a statistically significant one? Well, let's go back to Table 1. One thing I forgot to include here, for the women, 75% of the meat-eating women have one or more children. Only 34% of the vegan women. And, well, what do women do when they have kids? Most women breastfeed. And it turns out that breastfeeding protects against hip fractures in postmenopausal women, according to this study, and it probably does in premenopausal women too, but I don't have that study. So the authors of this study didn't even mention this possible connection. In fact, they didn't even talk about, to any significant extent, the fact that men and women differed in the results of their study. Barely mention it all. And I'd like to give a shout out to Mike the Vegan, the YouTube name of a YouTuber that I watch videos from occasionally, who does lots of videos on health-related issues relating to diet. Because he also did a video taking a critical look at this article that I thought was really excellent, and he's the one who clued me into the fact that there's a huge likely confound here where the meat-eating women were much more likely to engage in a behavior that has nothing whatsoever to do with diet than the vegan women were, that protects your bones. I appreciate what he's done. He does some very entertaining as well as informative videos, and like myself, he's a scientist, so he knows how to think about research and analyze it. So I'll put a link to his video in the description, and I highly recommend that you check it out. But just to kind of summarize, even if what this study claimed was true, was in fact true, that there was some inherent problem with eating a vegan diet as far as your bone health, you can't ignore all the other issues, heart health and protection from diabetes and cancer and so forth, and the impacts on animals and the environment. But the good news is, we don't have to swallow a bitter pill that a vegan diet's bad for you in terms of your bone health, because this study is bullshit. It's published somehow in a decent medical journal, but they really did a lousy job of interpreting their data, and frankly, it comes across as more of a propaganda piece against vegan diets than a scientific study. It does a poor job of ruling out confounding variables, and that ultimately make its conclusion that in some sort of general way, vegans are more likely to break bones than non-vegans. It's just completely mistaken. Pretty much in every way at this point, scientific research suggests that a whole foods plant-based diet is the healthiest one for us, and even in cases where it doesn't make a difference, it's certainly no less healthy in terms of our bone health than diet that contains animal products. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and please like and subscribe to the channel, and give me your feedback below. Let me know what you think. And I will see you next time.